You exercise, you stay active, you do everything you were told would keep your body young. And yet, when you stand up, your joints feel tight, your muscles resist, and movement doesn't feel free. That stiffness isn't laziness or aging catching up to you. It's the body quietly revealing that movement alone is not enough. Beneath the surface, biology is responding to stress, repetition, recovery, and time, shaping how your tissues adapt and how your nervous system holds tension. What feels like stiffness is often intelligence, the body's way of asking for balance, not just effort. We often begin with a quiet confusion that no one warns us about. You exercise regularly, you stay disciplined, you show up for your body even on days when motivation is thin, and yet something feels off. When you rise from a chair, there is resistance. When you wake in the morning, your body does not feel fluid or ready, but guarded, stiff, almost cautious. This experience feels personal, even disappointing, because effort is supposed to bring ease. But biology does not work on promises. It works on signals, and stiffness is one of the most honest signals the body can send. The first thing to understand is that the body does not measure health by how often you exercise. It measures survival by how consistently it feels supported. Muscles, joints, and connective tissues are not impressed by intensity alone. They respond to the environment they live in hour by hour. Exercise may take up 1 hour of the day, but the remaining 23 shape the deeper story. Long periods of sitting, emotional stress, shallow breathing, irregular sleep, and mental tension quietly rewrite how the body organizes itself. When those influences outweigh recovery, the body adapts by becoming protective. Stiffness, at its core, is not about tight muscles. It is about readiness. The body is constantly deciding whether it is safe to release or necessary to brace. When the nervous system senses ongoing stress, whether physical or emotional, it subtly increases muscle tone. This is not something you consciously choose. It is automatic, ancient, and deeply intelligent. The body tightens not because it is weak, but because it is trying to hold itself together in a world that feels demanding. Exercise performed on top of this background tension can sometimes reinforce the problem rather than resolve it. Repetitive movements, even healthy ones, teach the body a narrow vocabulary of motion. The tissues become strong in certain patterns, but less adaptable overall. Without variety, slowness, and rest, movement becomes mechanical. The body learns how to perform, but forgets how to soften. Over time, this creates a strange contradiction, a body that looks capable, but feels rigid from the inside. There is also the subtle influence of time. Not aging in the dramatic sense, but time spent under low-level strain. The body remembers everything. It remembers rushed mornings, skipped meals, poor sleep, unresolved stress, and the pressure to always do more. These experiences accumulate in the connective tissue, in the way joints move, in how easily muscles let go. Exercise cannot erase these memories by force. The body does not respond well to being overruled. It responds when it feels heard. Another overlooked aspect is hydration and circulation. Movement is meant to distribute fluid through joints and tissues, nourishing them from within. But when movement is rushed or performed without awareness, that fluid exchange is limited. Tissues begin to dry and lose elasticity. Stiffness emerges not because the body lacks motion, but because it lacks nourishment. In this state, stretching feels temporary, relief fades quickly, and the underlying sensation of resistance returns. Stiffness can also reflect a mismatch between effort and recovery. The body repairs itself during rest, not during movement. Without adequate recovery, tissues remain in a semi-repaired state, never fully resetting. This creates a constant background of tightness. even in those who appear active and fit. Rest is not the absence of discipline, it is the completion of it. Without rest, exercise becomes a withdrawal rather than an investment. Perhaps the most important realization is that stiffness is not the enemy. It is feedback. It is the body saying that something in its internal balance needs attention. When we treat stiffness as a flaw to be eliminated, we miss the opportunity to understand it. When we approach it with curiosity, it becomes a guide. It tells us about how we move, how we breathe, how we sleep, how we carry stress, and how we relate to our own limits. The body is not asking us to stop exercising. It is asking us to exercise differently, to live differently around that exercise, to remember that health is not built through force, but through cooperation. When movement is combined with awareness, recovery, and compassion, stiffness begins to lose its purpose because the body no longer needs to protect itself in the same way, and gradually it starts to respond. Not all at once, but slowly, intelligently, as living systems always do, adapting not just to what we do, but to how we do it, how often, and with what state of mind, shaping a body that is not merely active, but supported, listened to, and allowed to change in its own time. Movement inside the human body is far more than muscles pulling on bones. It is a quiet circulation of fluids, signals, and pressures that keep tissues alive and responsive. When we think of exercise, we imagine strength, endurance, flexibility. But rarely do we think about flow. Yet the body is built to move like water, not like machinery. Every joint depends on subtle changes in pressure to draw nourishment in and waste out. When movement becomes limited in variety or rushed in execution, that internal flow begins to slow, even if the body appears active from the outside. Joints do not have their own direct blood supply in the way muscles do. They rely on movement to stay healthy, especially slow, varied movement that gently compresses and releases tissue. This process acts like a pump, bathing the joint surfaces in fluid that keeps them smooth and resilient. When movement is repetitive or restricted to narrow patterns, that pump becomes inefficient. The joint still moves, but it does not drink deeply. Over time, the surfaces lose their sense of ease, and stiffness becomes the body's way of conserving what little fluid motion remains. The same principle applies to connective tissue, the vast network that wraps muscles, organs, and joints into a single integrated system. This tissue is designed to slide, stretch, and recoil. It thrives on diversity of motion, changes in speed, and moments of stillness. When daily life narrows movement into predictable shapes, sitting, walking, lifting in the same ways, even exercise can become another repetition. The tissue adapts by thickening and becoming less elastic, not as a failure, but as a logical response to limited information. Stiffness often emerges not because the body lacks movement, but because it lacks variation. The human body evolved to move unpredictably, to squat, twist, reach, crawl, and rest. Modern movement is efficient but narrow. Even well-designed workouts can unintentionally reinforce this narrowing if they repeat the same patterns week after week. The body becomes very good at those patterns, but less adaptable overall. Adaptability, not strength alone, is what creates the sensation of freedom in movement. Fluid dynamics inside the body are also deeply connected to breathing. Breath creates pressure changes that assist circulation, especially in the spine and core. Shallow or rushed breathing limits this effect. During exercise, many people unconsciously hold their breath or breathe only into the upper chest. This reduces internal movement, even as the external body works hard. Over time, tissues respond to this lack of internal motion by becoming more resistant, as if waiting for permission to soften. There is also a neurological layer to this experience. The brain does not distinguish sharply between physical and emotional patterns. Repetition creates predictability, and predictability reduces curiosity. When movement becomes predictable, the nervous system reduces sensory input. The body becomes efficient, but also dull. Stiffness can be understood as reduced conversation between the brain and tissues. Movement is happening, but awareness is absent. Without awareness, tissues receive less nuanced instruction, and they default to stability over mobility. This is why stiffness often feels worse after periods of inactivity, even in people who exercise regularly. The body has learned to move in certain windows of time and remain static the rest. Long stillness allows fluids to settle and tissues to thicken. When movement resumes, the body resists sudden change. This resistance is not punishment. It is inertia. Biological systems prefer gradual transitions. When life demands abrupt shifts from stillness to action, stiffness becomes the bridge between those states. Stretching alone often fails to resolve this because stretching addresses length, not flow. A muscle can be long and still feel stiff if the surrounding tissue is dehydrated or poorly circulated. True suppleness comes from movement that invites fluid exchange, not from forcing tissue into shapes. Slow transitions, gentle oscillations, and varied ranges of motion signal the body to rehydrate and reorganize itself from within. What we often interpret as aging is frequently a loss of internal movement rather than a loss of capacity. The tissues are still capable of responding, but they require different input. They need time, variation, and patience. The body does not rush adaptation, it listens for consistency. When movement becomes a daily dialogue rather than an occasional demand, tissues begin to regain their responsiveness. Understanding stiffness through this lens shifts the relationship we have with our bodies. Instead of asking how hard we should push, the question becomes how well we are circulating life through ourselves. Movement becomes less about burning energy and more about distributing it. When the body senses that movement is nourishing rather than demanding, it begins to release its grip, slowly allowing fluidity to return. Not because it was forced, but because it finally had the conditions it needed to remember how to move as a living system rather than a structure to be maintained. Inflammation is often imagined as something dramatic, swollen joints, sharp pain, visible injury. But the kind that shapes daily stiffness is quieter and far more persistent. It moves below awareness, woven into ordinary life through stress, poor sleep, irregular nourishment, and constant mental engagement. This low-level inflammatory state does not announce itself loudly. It simply changes how the body feels when it tries to move, creating a background of resistance that lingers even in people who appear outwardly healthy and active. The nervous system plays a central role in this process. Long before muscles tighten, the brain evaluates safety. When life feels demanding, unpredictable, or overwhelming, the nervous system shifts toward vigilance. In this state, the body prepares for challenge by subtly increasing muscle tone and reducing relaxation. This response once protected humans from danger, but in modern life, it often remains activated for long periods. The body learns to stay braced, not because of physical threat, but because mental and emotional pressures never fully turn off. This constant state of readiness affects how tissues repair themselves. Inflammatory signals interfere with recovery, slowing the process by which muscles and connective tissues reset after use. Exercise, which should create adaptation, begins to pile on top of incomplete repair. The body never fully clears the metabolic debris of effort. Instead of returning to a neutral baseline, tissues remain slightly irritated, slightly swollen at a microscopic level, and slightly less willing to move freely. Sleep is one of the most powerful regulators of inflammation, yet it is often the first thing sacrificed. Inadequate or disrupted sleep keeps stress hormones elevated, reinforcing the inflammatory state. The body enters the day already tense, already behind. Movement performed in this state does not feel restorative. It feels like work. Over time, the association between movement and strain becomes embedded in the nervous system, further reinforcing stiffness. Nutrition also shapes this internal environment. When the body lacks consistent access to nutrients that support cellular repair, inflammation lingers longer than it should. Blood sugar fluctuations, dehydration, and nutrient deficiencies quietly amplify tissue sensitivity. This does not always produce pain, but it creates a sense of heaviness and restriction. The body moves, but reluctantly, as if conserving energy rather than expressing it. Emotional stress deserves equal attention. The body does not separate psychological experience from physical state. Worry, unresolved tension, and mental overload manifest as muscle guarding, particularly in the neck, shoulders, hips, and lower back. These areas become storage sites for stress, maintaining low-grade contraction throughout the day. Stretching these muscles may provide brief relief, but without addressing the underlying nervous system state, the tension quickly returns. This is why stiffness can persist even when flexibility appears adequate. A muscle can be technically flexible yet neurologically guarded. The brain does not allow full release if it perceives instability or threat. True relaxation requires a sense of safety, not just physical capacity. When the nervous system remains alert, the body chooses protection over ease. Chronic low-grade inflammation also alters how the brain perceives sensation. Sensory signals from the body become amplified or distorted. Movements that were once effortless now feel heavy or uncomfortable. This does not mean the body is damaged. It means the nervous system is interpreting input through a lens of caution. The body is not broken. It is listening too carefully for signs of strain. Exercise performed without attention to this internal state can inadvertently reinforce inflammation. High intensity or prolonged effort without sufficient recovery increases stress hormones and inflammatory markers. Over time, this creates a cycle where movement is associated with fatigue rather than vitality. The body begins to resist motion as a form of self-preservation. Breaking this cycle does not require abandoning exercise. It requires restoring balance to the nervous system. Gentle movement, controlled breathing, adequate rest, and emotional regulation all signal safety. When these signals are consistent, inflammatory processes begin to quiet. Tissues recover more completely. Muscle tone decreases naturally. Stiffness loses its purpose because the body no longer feels the need to stay guarded. Understanding stiffness through the lens of inflammation and nervous system health transforms it from a mechanical problem into a relational one. It is not about forcing the body to comply, but about creating conditions in which it can soften. When the internal environment shifts from constant alertness to steady support, movement becomes easier, not because the body was pushed harder, but because it was finally allowed to rest, repair, and respond to life with less resistance, gradually revealing that freedom of movement is as much about inner calm as it is about physical strength. Connective tissue changes quietly, without drama, and because of that, it is often misunderstood. Muscles announce themselves with soreness and fatigue, but the tissues that hold everything together adapt slowly, patiently, over years rather than days. This network, often overlooked, shapes how the body feels more than how it looks. It responds not only to movement, but to how movement is performed, how often it is repeated, and whether the body is given enough time to restore its elasticity between efforts. This tissue is designed to be springy and responsive. In a healthy state, it stretches under load and recoils when the load is released, allowing force to travel efficiently through the body. But when movement is always rushed or forceful, recoil becomes incomplete. The tissue remains slightly stretched or slightly contracted, accumulating tension that never fully dissipates. Over time, this creates a sensation of stiffness that is not located in any single muscle, but felt everywhere, like the body has lost its natural rhythm. Breathing plays a subtle but profound role here. Each breath gently moves the connective tissue surrounding the organs, spine, and rib cage. Deep, slow breathing encourages this tissue to glide and hydrate. Shallow breathing limits this internal motion, allowing layers to become sticky and less responsive. Many people exercise intensely while breathing shallowly, reinforcing tension instead of releasing it. The body becomes strong but rigid, capable but constrained. The pace of modern life accelerates this process. When movement is constantly paired with urgency, the body associates action with stress. Connective tissue responds by prioritizing stability over elasticity. This response is not a mistake, it is an adaptation. Stability feels safer when the nervous system is overloaded. Unfortunately, long-term stability without softness reduces freedom of movement. The body begins to feel heavy, dense, and resistant, even in the absence of pain. Recovery is where connective tissue truly remodels itself. Unlike muscles, which can adapt relatively quickly, connective tissue requires long periods of low stress to reorganize. Sleep, stillness, and gentle movement provide the conditions for this remodeling. Without sufficient recovery, the tissue remains in a semi-adapted state, never fully resetting. Exercise continues to layer tension on top of tension, gradually reducing elasticity. Age amplifies these effects, not because the tissue is failing, but because adaptation slows. With time, the body requires more consistent signals of safety and nourishment to maintain suppleness. Quick fixes lose their effectiveness. Stretching harder, pushing further, or training more aggressively often backfires. The tissue responds better to patience than to pressure. Hydration also influences tissue quality. Connective tissue is rich in water, and its ability to glide depends on adequate hydration. Dehydration, even mild, increases friction between layers. This friction is felt as stiffness, particularly in the morning or after periods of inactivity. Movement helps distribute fluid, but without consistent hydration, the benefits are limited. The body becomes less forgiving, more resistant to change. There is also an emotional dimension to connective tissue adaptation. Chronic stress, unresolved tension, and emotional restraint manifest physically as holding patterns. The tissue becomes a storage system for experiences the mind has not fully processed. This is not metaphorical. The nervous system directly influences tissue tone. When emotional stress is constant, the body maintains subtle contraction as a form of containment. Over time, this containment feels like stiffness. Exercise that focuses solely on performance ignores this deeper layer. When movement is treated as a task to complete rather than a sensation to experience, the body misses opportunities to release. Slower, more mindful movement allows the nervous system to notice safety. This noticing is what permits tissue to soften. Without it, the body continues to armor itself, regardless of how fit it appears. Understanding stiffness as a connective tissue response reframes the solution. The question is no longer how to stretch harder, but how to create conditions for elasticity to return. Variety of movement, attention to breath, sufficient rest, hydration, and emotional regulation all feed into this process. When these elements align, connective tissue gradually regains its spring, allowing movement to feel lighter and more fluid. The body does not resist movement without reason. It resists when elasticity has been sacrificed for stability over too long a period. When given time, patience, and supportive signals, it responds not with sudden change, but with a gradual softening that reflects a deeper restoration of balance, reminding us that true mobility is not forced into existence, but emerges naturally when the body feels safe enough to let go. Stiffness becomes a problem only when we misunderstand it, when we treat it as something broken, something to fight or eliminate. We create resistance on top of resistance. But stiffness itself is not a flaw in the body's design. It is a form of communication. One of the clearest ways the body expresses that something in its internal balance needs attention. The body does not speak in words. It speaks in sensations, and stiffness is one of its most consistent languages. Every biological system relies on feedback loops. The body is constantly adjusting based on what it experiences. When movement is excessive, recovery is limited, or stress is persistent, the body adapts to protect itself. That adaptation often shows up as stiffness. It is not punishment, it is strategy. The body tightens to create stability when it senses that resources are limited or demands are high. Seen this way, stiffness is evidence of intelligence, not failure. Many people approach stiffness with frustration, stretching harder, pushing through discomfort, or increasing intensity in an attempt to overcome it. But force rarely resolves a signal that was created by imbalance. The body responds better to curiosity than aggression. When we slow down enough to notice when stiffness appears, how it changes throughout the day, and what seems to soften it, we begin to understand what the body is asking for. Often, the request is not more effort, but more support. Support can take many forms. It can be rest that is truly restful, not just time off filled with stimulation. It can be movement that explores rather than repeats, inviting the body into new ranges instead of forcing old ones. It can be breath that reaches deep into the body, creating space where tension once lived. It can be nourishment that stabilizes energy instead of spiking it. These inputs tell the nervous system that it no longer needs to brace. The relationship between the mind and the body is central here. When we are impatient with our bodies, when we demand performance without listening, the body responds by becoming more guarded. When we approach it with compassion, something changes. Compassion is not passive, it is attentive. It involves noticing limits without judgment and responding thoughtfully. This changes how the nervous system perceives movement. What once felt like threat begins to feel like exploration. Stiffness often reflects a history of being pushed rather than partnered with. Many people learn to ignore subtle discomfort until it becomes impossible to ignore. By the time stiffness is constant, it has already been present in quieter forms for a long time. Listening earlier, responding gently, and adjusting habits gradually can reverse this process. The body is remarkably adaptable when given consistent signals of safety and care. There is also an element of identity involved. Many people define themselves by discipline, productivity, and endurance. Stiffness challenges that identity by forcing limits into awareness. It asks uncomfortable questions about rest, vulnerability, and sustainability. Resisting those questions keeps the body in a state of tension. Allowing them opens the door to a different relationship with movement, one based on longevity rather than output. When stiffness is met with understanding, it often begins to soften on its own. Not instantly and not dramatically, but gradually. The body senses that it no longer needs to shout to be heard. Muscles release not because they are stretched, but because the nervous system permits them to. Joints move more freely, not because they are forced, but because fluid exchange improves. Movement becomes less about fixing and more about experiencing. This shift transforms exercise from a task into a dialogue. Each movement becomes a question rather than a command. How does this feel today? What does my body need right now? When those questions guide action, stiffness becomes information rather than an obstacle. The body stops resisting because it is no longer being ignored. Ultimately, stiffness teaches patience. It reminds us that the body operates on biological time, not mental urgency. Adaptation unfolds slowly, through repetition of supportive choices rather than dramatic interventions. When we align our behavior with how living systems actually work, stiffness loses its role as a warning signal. It fades into the background as balance is restored, leaving behind a body that feels not only more mobile, but more trusted, more understood, and more willing to move through life with ease rather than defense.